Today I'm going to show you how to make a modern white oak nightstand. Start off with some white oak. I don't have a jointer, so I use a sled through the planer with some shims to take any wobble out of the board and give me one flat reference edge. Once you have that edge, you can run it with that flat side down through the planer again and bring it to final thickness. Then I use a sled to taper one side of it and get one flat reference edge on the board from the table saw. Then run it through with that reference edge against the fence to bring it down to final width and have an S4S piece of lumber. Then you just do that again and again and again and again. 11 times. I really wish I had a joiner. Once all the pieces are surfaced, I can move on to gluing up some panels. For this project, I glued up 3 panels, one for the top, one for the bottom, and one to be cut in half for the sides. Just spread the glue around and clamp up. Some people like to try and minimize squeeze out. I tend to just clean it up afterwards. I find a putty knife is great for this. All you have to do is scrape along the creases where the glue squeezed out, it comes right off. Another tactic I've used is a razor blade. Just slide it along. A little bit harder on the fingers, but it does a great job as long as it doesn't catch too much on the wood. And if all else fails, sometimes I'll break out a chisel. But usually a putty knife's my best bet. Once I have most of the glue off, I rough sand with 80 grit sandpaper in my random orbit sander. This smooths out the edge joints between the boards where they might not have glued up perfectly, and also takes off any leftover glue. Once the boards are all cleaned up, I give them a look over and decide which one's going to be which piece. This is going to be the bottom. The far piece looks nicest, so I'm going to make it the top, as it's the face that most people will see. And then the middle piece was the middle quality, so it'll be the 2 sides. Then I take each panel over to my table saw, adjust the height so that it'll cut through the board on the crosscut sled and crosscut off a straight edge. This will make sure all the boards that might not have been lined up perfectly are now cut to the exact same length. I can then cut the panels down to the proper width. And then use that edge that I cut off before as a guide along the fence to cut the panels down to their final size. Now, for the bottom panel in particular, I noticed that one of the boards was a little bit bowed, which meant it was more noticeably separated from the other boards on the ends. So rather than just cutting off one end, I cut a little bit off of each side to get the nicer looking middle portion. So here you can see, still using that reference edge on the far side along the fence. Going to cut a little bit off the far side, then adjust the fence, flip the board around, and cut a little bit off the other side. This will give me the best glue up portion for that bottom panel. Even though it's not going to be seen as often, I like to take that extra step. So then I go out and mark out some lines where I want my fingers for the finger joints that are going to be holding the edges together. For this, I just chose to do 1-inch long fingers, and I started measuring from each side, leaving a very large finger in the middle as kind of an artistic choice, and also, as you'll see in a minute, to try and hopefully save me a little bit of cutting. Then I set the depth of the table saw blade to just over the thickness of the board. This will make the fingers almost perfectly interlocked together with just a little bit of overlap that I can clean up later. And then it's simply a case of passing the board on the crosscut sled over the table saw blade, moving it over a little bit, passing again to cut out those grooves. There are tons of tutorials out there. If you have a dado stack on how to use that with a sled of some sort, then you don't have to worry about this cleanup. You don't have to worry about so many passes. It looks much simpler, but I don't have a dado stack, so I just did it this way. Then I line up the top along on top of the side panel and sketch out exactly where I want those lines to be. This will ensure that those fingers from the side panel will line up perfectly with the grooves cut into the top panel. And then it's just more cutting. One pro tip I found while doing these, you're going to be holding this board for a really long time. So it helps if you just break the edges of the board with a piece of sandpaper. Just run it over a couple times. Your hands will thank you. Also, it was about at this point when I was cutting out the very large key here for the center of the side panel that I realized the flaw in my thinking that leaving one large finger in the middle of the top panel would lead to less cuts. But I think it turned out nice. Once all the panels had the fingers cut out and labeled, labeling is key here because they don't always match up with every panel, I dry fit everything to make sure I knew what I was doing when it came time for glue up. Once it was good and fit, I pulled the top and bottom pieces off, added a bunch of glue, and then squeezed them all back together. And then I used some small clamps and my speed square to try and make one of the corners square. This would allow for better alignment, and theoretically in my mind, if one corner is square and everything else is tight, everything should be square. Although I wanted to be extra safe, so in advance I cut a scrap piece of wood to have edges that were perfectly square to each other, and then use some other small clamps to clamp another corner. I kind of wanted to do the opposite corner, but I didn't have enough room down on the bottom of this, so I figured this would do. I then went ahead and used every clamp that I own to clamp this piece together. One thing to watch out when clamping something like this up is make sure your clamps are pressing on the base of the wood and not pressing on the ends of the fingers and not actually clamping anything. After letting it sit for the night, I came back out and took off all my clamps. Then after some cleanup, I took my router and a flush trim bit and trimmed off all the extended fingers so everything was flush. Next, using the good old glue and sawdust method, I made some homemade wood filler and began to fill in any gaps in the finger joints. I find the best way to apply this is just smear it all over the place and then come back with a plaster knife and scrape off all the extra. Yeah, smear it in there. I went around the piece, filling in all the gaps I could see and even some that I couldn't. Making sure as I went to clean up with that putty knife so that I would have less sanding to do afterwards. But I still had a whole lot of sanding to do. So much sanding. After about 4 hours of sanding, I taped off where I was going to put the legs. These were just some hairpin legs I ordered off Amazon. Using my combination square, I set a 3/4 inch space from each edge so that I knew the leg would sit perfectly where I wanted it, just off of the fingers. Then I used one of the legs to mark out where all the screw holes could go. Then using a drill bit with some tape on it, I drilled the holes, making sure not to go so deep that the screws would pass all the way through the 3/4 inch panel, just deep enough that they could catch and hold the legs in place. For this, I decided to use Danish oil. It seemed like an easy to apply finish, and it left me with pretty satisfying final results. It really makes the grain pop. All you've got to do is flood the piece with a rag, let sit for about 15 minutes, apply another coat, let sit for 15 minutes, and then wipe off the excess. Giving it some time after that to cure and dry up properly, but that's really all there is to it. Another thing I should point out here is I started by flooding the bottom panel first. This way, when I flip it to get to the top, the only piece that would have wet finish touching those little sticks underneath there is the bottom. That way, if there were any issues with that, luckily there weren't, you wouldn't see them. Once the finish had dried, I attached all the legs. I should point out that the screws that came with these legs were a little bit too long, so I had to custom order some more that would be short enough to not go through the bottom plate. Definitely wouldn't want that with a visible surface. And that was that. And now I have this beautiful modern end table sitting right beside my bed in my room. The perfect part is that opening holds books perfectly, which is great if you're a nighttime reader.